There are wounds inside you that do not look like wounds when life is moving fast. They do not always feel like pain. They often feel like instinct, like urgency, like that sudden tightening in your chest when someone's tone changes, like the strange rush to defend yourself before anyone has fully accused you, like the way one delayed message can alter the atmosphere of your entire day. You tell yourself you are just being careful, intuitive, sensitive, emotionally aware. But sometimes what you call awareness is an old injury reacting before your mind has had time to see clearly. And that is where the real danger begins. Because the moment a wound can be activated on cue, you can be moved on cue as well. Most people imagine control as something obvious. Domination, threats, force, open manipulation. But real psychological control is often quieter than that. It works through your unfinished pain. It works through the places inside you where fear still outruns reason, where old shame still outranks truth, where loneliness still weakens judgment, where rejection still feels like danger instead of information. A person does not need to overpower you physically to govern your reactions. They only need access to the right wound. And once that access is found, your energy, your mood, your choices, your self-respect, even your perception of reality can begin shifting in response to pressure you barely understand. This is why some people seem to know exactly how to throw you off balance. Not necessarily because they are brilliant or evil, but because unhealed wounds are predictable. The fear of abandonment produces a certain pattern. The wound of shame produces another. Unworthiness, betrayal, emotional deprivation, rejection, helplessness, humiliation. Each one leaves a kind of psychological signature. And if you have not studied those signatures in yourself, you will keep confusing reaction for truth. You will keep believing that the intensity you feel is proof that the moment is important, when often it is proof that something older has been touched. Carl Jung understood that what remains unconscious does not remain passive. It operates. It interferes. It speaks through symptoms, impulses, overreactions, attractions, resentments, compulsions, and repeated patterns that seem to have a life of their own. The Stoics understood something closely related. Your freedom depends less on external conditions than on your inner governance. Put those two insights together and a difficult truth emerges. The unexamined wound is one of the greatest threats to your sovereignty. Because if your inner life is full of hidden fractures, then the outside world will keep finding buttons to press. And every time it does, you will think life is happening to you, when in reality a wound is running the interaction from beneath the surface. This video is about 8 psychological wounds that make you react on command. Not because you are weak, not because you are broken, but because pain that has not been understood becomes highly responsive. It waits in the nervous system. It waits in the body. It waits in expectation. It waits in interpretation. And then it lights up when someone says the right thing, withholds the right thing, or withdraws at exactly the point where your old story begins. But once you see these wounds clearly, something powerful starts to happen. The reaction loses some of its mystery. The trigger loses some of its authority. And in that growing space between what happens and what you do, your mind begins returning to you. The first wound is abandonment. This is one of the most powerful wounds because it attaches itself directly to safety. If some part of you learned that closeness can disappear suddenly, that affection can turn cold without explanation, that attention can be withdrawn when you need it most, then your system does not treat distance as a neutral event. It treats it as danger. That is why someone's silence can feel louder than words. Why a slower reply can trigger an internal storm. Why a slight shift in warmth can turn you restless, hypervigilant, eager to fix, eager to close the gap before it widens any further. This is what makes abandonment so exploitable. The person who discovers that your nervous system cannot tolerate distance does not need to control you through confrontation. They can do it through inconsistency. A little warmth, a little withdrawal, a little return, a little uncertainty, and suddenly your attention is hooked. Your mind is elsewhere. Your peace is outsourced. You begin managing the relationship from fear instead of from truth. You say more than you mean. You tolerate more than you should. You start bargaining with your dignity in the name of connection. And the most painful part is that this often feels like love while it is happening. Healing abandonment does not mean becoming detached from people. It means refusing to let another person's emotional movement decide whether you are safe inside yourself. It means learning to notice the panic without obeying it instantly. Learning to remain present when distance appears, rather than rushing to fill it with performance, explanation, or self-erasure. Once the wound is seen, the old urgency loses some of its grip. And when the fear of being left no longer governs your decisions, you become much harder to move through uncertainty. The second wound is rejection. This wound does not always look dramatic. Often it appears as chronic self-editing. You enter rooms already adjusting. You think before you speak, but not in the healthy sense. You think in order to minimize disapproval. You soften your opinions, hide your edges, rehearse your responses, shape yourself around what seems acceptable. You become a careful version of yourself before the world has even demanded it. That is what rejection does. It teaches you that not being chosen is too costly, too exposing, too painful to risk openly. Once that wound exists, the possibility of exclusion becomes a leash. You no longer need explicit threats. You can be steered by atmosphere alone. A colder room, a disapproving face, a superior tone, a shift in group energy. All of it becomes data that your system uses to regulate your behavior. You become easier to herd because your deepest priority is no longer truth. It is acceptance. And when acceptance outranks truth, the mind becomes vulnerable to pressure from groups, authority figures, partners, and environments that know exactly how to reward conformity and punish difference. Healing rejection means discovering that disapproval is not destruction. That not being chosen in one place does not diminish your value. That you can survive social friction without abandoning your center. This is not about becoming combative or indifferent. It is about becoming internally anchored. Once rejection no longer feels like erasure, you stop reacting so quickly to the moods of the room. You stop surrendering your clarity for the sake of immediate approval. And that is when your mind begins to stand on its own legs. The third wound is shame. Shame is different from pain because it does not simply say something hurt. It says there is something about you that should not be seen. It teaches concealment. It teaches editing. It teaches you to divide your inner life into acceptable and dangerous parts. The acceptable self goes forward. The rest goes underground: your anger, your need, your sensitivity, your desire, your insecurity, your grief, your fear. You learn how to appear composed while internally fragmented. You learn how to smile over discomfort, how to say, "It's fine," when it isn't, how to remain pleasing while parts of you disappear in silence. Shame makes you react on command because whatever you are ashamed of can be activated instantly. If you are ashamed of seeming needy, someone can control you by withholding just enough to make you overcorrect. If you are ashamed of your anger, someone can keep violating you while you call your silence maturity. If you are ashamed of your sensitivity, one mocking glance can reorganize your whole body. Shame leaves hidden wires everywhere. The world does not even need to understand them fully. It only needs to touch them. And then your behavior starts organizing around protection from exposure. Healing shame begins when you stop treating parts of yourself like contraband. When you can look at your own humanity without immediately trying to sanitize it. You do not have to glorify every impulse. You simply have to stop being at war with your interior life. Because the more at peace you are with what is real in you, the less easily others can govern you through humiliation, subtle ridicule, or the fear of being seen too clearly. The fourth wound is unworthiness. This wound often hides behind productivity, discipline, ambition, and self-improvement. It can look admirable from the outside. But underneath is a deeply exhausting belief that you are not enough unless you are proving something. Proving your value, your intelligence, your usefulness, your beauty, your control, your strength, your goodness, your importance. When worth becomes conditional, life stops feeling like a place to live and starts feeling like a stage on which you must constantly justify your existence. This wound makes you reactive because approval becomes chemically significant. Praise lifts you higher than it should. Criticism hits harder than it should. Silence from the wrong person feels heavier than it should. You are not simply receiving feedback. You are treating outside responses like evidence of whether you deserve self-respect. That is a devastating way to live because it gives too much power to things that were never stable enough to define you. The person who learns how much you need validation can control your energy through the smallest changes in tone. Healing unworthiness means separating your value from your performance. It means understanding that growth is still possible without self-contempt, that failure is still survivable without identity collapse, that being imperfect does not disqualify you from dignity. Once your worth is no longer hanging in the balance during every interaction, the outside world loses one of its easiest ways of throwing you off center. You can hear correction without crumbling. You can be misunderstood without becoming smaller. You can improve without begging life to tell you that you matter. The fifth wound is betrayal. This wound forms when trust was used against you, when honesty met deception, when vulnerability met exploitation, when what was shared in openness became material for injury. Betrayal leaves a very specific distortion behind. It does not simply make you cautious. It can make you split. One part of you longs for closeness, certainty, and sincerity. Another part expects manipulation, hidden motives, and sudden reversal. This split makes perception unstable. You may distrust what is good because it feels unfamiliar, while feeling magnetized toward inconsistency because it resembles old emotional terrain. Betrayal makes you reactive because your system becomes hypersensitive to signs of hidden threat. Small inconsistencies take on huge emotional weight. Ordinary ambiguity feels loaded. At the same time, the longing to finally secure trustworthy closeness can make you disclose too soon, attach too fast, or excuse what your deeper intelligence has already noticed. That is how the wound traps you from both sides. Fear distorts your reading and hunger distorts it too. Either one can make you easier to manipulate. Healing betrayal means rebuilding trust in your own perception before demanding guarantees from other people. It means learning how to notice discomfort without dismissing it, and how to feel hope without letting hope override discernment. The more deeply you trust yourself, the less control others gain through mixed signals, emotional smoke, or strategic inconsistency. You stop reacting to confusion as if it were mystery. You stop mistaking volatility for depth. And your mind becomes less available to those who rely on uncertainty to keep you emotionally occupied. The sixth wound is powerlessness. This wound is born from repeated experiences of not being able to influence what was happening. Perhaps your truth was ignored. Perhaps your boundaries were dismissed. Perhaps your needs were mocked, minimized, or treated as inconvenient. Over time, the psyche adapts. It lowers expectations. It stops reaching with full force. It stops believing that clear expression matters. Then something subtle happens. Silence begins to feel wiser than agency, not because it is, but because helplessness has become familiar. This wound makes you react on command because you begin surrendering internally before the moment has fully tested you. A stronger personality enters and you shrink. Conflict appears and you soften prematurely. Pressure rises and you call resignation peace. The outside world starts shaping your reality simply because some part of you no longer believes you have the right or the power to shape it yourself. That belief turns you into easy terrain for stronger wills, manipulative dynamics, and environments that reward passivity. Healing powerlessness begins in small acts that seem almost insignificant from the outside. A no spoken clearly. A preference voiced without apology. A delay instead of automatic compliance. A boundary held through the discomfort of being misunderstood. These acts are not minor to the nervous system. They are evidence. Evidence that agency still exists. Evidence that expression is not the same thing as danger. Evidence that your will has not disappeared, it has merely been buried under old lessons that no longer deserve authority. The seventh wound is emotional deprivation. This wound forms when your emotional needs were consistently underfed. Not always through cruelty. Often through absence, distraction, inconsistency, immaturity, or care that was present in fragments but never in the steady way you truly needed. When this happens, deprivation becomes normal. Your system adapts to too little. Then it starts mistaking small amounts of warmth for abundance. A little attention feels extraordinary. A little tenderness feels life-changing. A little consistency feels almost holy. Hunger distorts proportion. This is why emotional deprivation makes you so reactive. You become vulnerable to crumbs, to intermittent affection, to partial presence, to unstable attention. Anything that relieves the old hunger can capture your mind far more than it should. You wait, replay, fantasize, excuse, and remain in situations that are clearly beneath your deeper worth simply because some part of you is still starving enough to call scarcity love. That is one of the most painful forms of control because it feels like hope while it is draining you. Healing emotional deprivation requires grief. Grief for how little was once normal. Grief for the ways you learned to be grateful for fragments. Grief for the standards you lowered just to stay connected to something. But that grief is clarifying. It restores proportion. It teaches you what nourishment actually looks like. Steadiness, mutuality, calm, reliability, emotional presence that does not need to be chased. Once you recognize true nourishment, bait loses much of its glamour. And when bait loses its glamour, your mind becomes less easy to capture. The eighth wound is humiliation. This wound is formed when your dignity was attacked in ways that left a deep imprint. Public embarrassment, mockery, being made to feel small, being exposed, dismissed, belittled, or treated as inferior in moments that cut deeper than anyone around you understood. Humiliation is not just pain. It is pain mixed with collapse. It creates a particular sensitivity to being lowered in the eyes of others. And because of that, it can make you highly reactive to disrespect, especially where power, status, or belonging are involved. Humiliation creates control because once a person fears being lowered, they become highly governable through status pressure. A superior tone can provoke immediate defensiveness. A subtle insult can dominate your thoughts for days. A condescending gesture can make you over-explain, overperform, overcorrect, or explode. The wound is not responding to the present moment alone. It is responding to an older collapse that still lives in the body. That is why the reaction is so intense. The past enters the room disguised as the present, and the mind obeys before it has fully understood what is happening. Healing humiliation means rebuilding dignity from the inside rather than begging the outside world to never wound it again. It means learning that another person's attempt to diminish you does not define your actual stature. It means becoming less dependent on performance, image, or immediate victory in order to remain internally upright. Once dignity is rooted more deeply within you, disrespect loses some of its power to hijack your mind. You can see it, name it, even address it without being completely possessed by the need to undo it. When you step back and look at these 8 wounds together, abandonment, rejection, shame, unworthiness, betrayal, powerlessness, emotional deprivation, and humiliation, a pattern emerges. Each wound creates an access point. Each one turns something external into a trigger for internal instability. Each one makes certain words, silences, gestures, delays, criticisms, withdrawals, or atmospheres disproportionately powerful. In other words, each wound reduces the distance between stimulus and reaction. And wherever that distance is small, control becomes easy. This is why reclaiming your mind is not merely about discipline. Discipline matters, but it has limits. You can build routines, habits, and mental frameworks, yet still find yourself hijacked in the moments that touch an older pain. Real reclamation begins when you bring honest attention to the wound beneath the reaction. Not just what happened, but what it touched. Not just what they did, but why it moved you so quickly. Not just the event, but the access point. That is shadow work in practice. Not abstract theory. Not decorative introspection. Direct inner investigation. In those moments, the most powerful thing you can do is pause long enough to separate the present from the past. Someone goes silent. Someone criticizes you. Someone withdraws warmth. Someone disapproves. Someone offers crumbs. Someone tries to lower you. Instead of moving instantly, ask, what exactly has been touched in me? Is this moment itself as large as it feels, or is it connected to something older, something unfinished, something that has not yet been fully understood? That question does not erase emotion, but it interrupts possession. It keeps you from mistaking activation for truth. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. That statement sounds noble until life presses against your wounds. Then it becomes practical. Because the real obstacle is not merely the outside event. It is the place inside you where the outside event gains too much access. Heal that place and your relationship to the world changes. The event may still happen. The criticism may still come. The rejection may still sting. The uncertainty may still be present. But your mind is no longer so easily occupied by what touches it. This is what psychological sovereignty actually looks like. Not emotional numbness. Not superiority. Not cold detachment. It is the growing ability to remain with yourself while the wound is being touched. To feel the charge without surrendering your entire mind to it. To respond rather than react. To choose according to your values rather than according to your panic. To let the world be what it is without granting it unlimited access to your center. That kind of power is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. But everyone can feel its difference. Nobody reclaims the mind by pretending these wounds are not there. The work begins in honesty. In noticing where your peace collapses too quickly. Where your dignity becomes negotiable. Where your perception becomes distorted by hunger, fear, shame, or old helplessness. Once you see the pattern, you can stop worshiping the trigger. You can stop treating every intense feeling like a command. You can stop giving outside conditions the right to author your inner life so easily. The world will always contain difficult people, manipulative dynamics, unstable relationships, and moments designed to test your center. That part does not disappear. But the access points can close. The old wires can weaken. The reactions can slow. The wound can stop being the first thing to speak. And when that happens, something profound shifts. You are no longer so programmable. No longer so easily baited into over-explaining, over-pursuing, over-performing, over-fearing, over-shrinking. The mind becomes less crowded, more deliberate, more your own. Reclaiming your mind is not a single breakthrough. It is a practice, a series of returns. A commitment to stay present when old fractures ask for obedience. A refusal to confuse familiarity with truth. A willingness to grieve what shaped you without allowing it to continue governing you. Over time, the wound that once reacted on command becomes a signal rather than a ruler. It still speaks, but it does not decide. It still trembles, but it does not command your every movement. That is healing. Not the absence of all pain, but the end of automatic surrender to it. So if you want to become harder to control, do not begin by studying only the people who press your buttons. Study the buttons. Study the wounds. Study the hidden architecture of your reactions. Because the person who knows their own access points is already reclaiming power. And the person who heals them becomes increasingly difficult to govern through fear, approval, shame, distance, deprivation, or disrespect. That is how you reclaim your mind. Not by dominating the world, but by refusing to let the world keep ruling you through what remains unhealed.